Hello friends, this is Tim Collins coming to you again with our weekend word. Today I want to talk about ministry gifts. In Ephesians chapter 4, God says that Jesus gave gifts to the church. Verse 8 says, when he ascended on high, he led captives in his train and gave gifts to men. Then he goes on in verse 11 and enumerates some of those ministry gifts that God gave the church. It was he who gave some to be apostles, some to be prophets, some to be evangelists, and some to be pastors and teachers. Let me just tell you my story. I believe that I was called to preach before I was born. My mother said she heard the audible voice of God speak to her, and from the very moment I could talk, I was preaching. I would line up chairs and preach to them. I'd go with Mother to the church to clean the church, and while she was cleaning, I would preach to the empty pews. And when I was 7 years old, God opened a door for me to preach in church for the first time on a Sunday morning service. When I was 9 years old, I preached a revival, a full week's revival. And so God had his hand on me, and God called me from birth as a gift to the church. Later on as an adult, got married, did a couple of hitches in the Air Force, during which I worked and was involved in ministry on some level all the time. My second hitch down at Eglin Air Force Base, Florida, I was serving as a part-time evangelist, traveled around the southeast there a little bit, preaching weekend revivals and so forth, and back at work on Monday morning. But then I felt God calling me into pastoral ministry, so I got out of the Air Force and went into pastoral ministry, pastored 2 churches in Alabama over the next 10 years, and then in 1995, God opened a door to move me to the state of Missouri, and so I moved to pastor Central Assembly of God in Independence, Missouri for 9.5 years. But the last year and a half or so, maybe 2 years that I was there, I felt God was calling me to a change of ministry. And we prayed about it for several months, and eventually in April of 2005, resigned the church, went back into the evangelistic field, and I've done that full time now for 6.5 years. And so as such, I have spent my life in ministry and as God's gift to the church. God has called me to give my life for the church. Now, as I say, as such, as a pastor, a teacher, evangelist, I'm a gift, a ministry gift to the church. Now, why does God give these gifts to the church? Verse 12 tells us to prepare God's people for works of service, so that the body of Christ may be built up. Well, the question comes up sometimes, does God still use spiritual gifts in the church? Does God still give all these ministry gifts to the church? Are all these gifts still necessary in a modern church? Verse 13 tells us how long these gifts will be needed. Until we all reach unity in the faith and in the knowledge of the Son of God and become mature, attaining to the whole measure of the fullness of Christ. Well, it sounds to me like they are really needed. Because does this verse 14 and 15, does this describe the modern church? Then we will no longer be infants, tossed back and forth by the waves and blown here and there by every wind of teaching and by the cunning and craftiness of men and their deceitful scheming. Instead, speaking the truth in love, we will in all things grow up into him who is the head, that is Christ. From him the whole body, joined and held together by every supporting ligament, grows and builds itself up in love as each part does its work. Does that really describe the modern church today? I'm going to go out on a limb and say I don't think so. I think we have some growing and maturing to do, and so the gifts that God gave the church are still necessary in the church. Tell you what, I'm going to unhitch right here because I'm getting real long-winded. I will continue with a couple more thoughts about spiritual gifts and ministry gifts next week. So meanwhile, be in church somewhere on Sunday. Spend some quality time with God. God bless you. We love you.